Welcome everybody to week 3, the exact science of the hard matter part 2. We are still on chapter 2 of the textbook, but today we will focus on examining, controlling, and verifying. And the first topic for this week will be neuroanatomy. Now this is one of the most important topics in this course, given that the course itself is focused on neuroscience, so a solid basis of the most important neuroanatomical structure as well as the related function will be required to further investigate the topics that we'll discuss from week 4 through week 15. Now, what is the main element when we talk about neuroanatomy? Well, I would say that we could start from the central nervous system, and again, this would be a somewhat introductive basic analysis of the CNS, and the best way to do this is by analyzing the brain. So I have a little model here with me, and I hope you can all see. I'll try to keep it next to the light so you can see all the parts of our model, a little friend here. And I will try to zoom in and out to make sure that each part will be clearly analyzed and visible to all of you. So we're talking about the brain. We're talking about the central part of who we are from a neuroanatomical perspective, at least. So let's see what the brain will entail in terms of the basic function that the brain is responsible for and the structure. So you can see this is the right hemisphere here. Let me see, make sure to show it to you at the light. And this would be the sagittal section through the brain. And the first thing I would like to talk to you about is how to identify what we see in front of us. So it can be somewhat confusing to take a look at the brain from a broader perspective because of the very structure of gyri and sulci, or giri and sulci, if you want to use the Latin or archaic Greek pronunciation. And the external structure resembles to some extent what you can see inside. Now, to use some colors, one of the first things that I would like to talk about is the difference between front and back. So let's use this terminology for the time being, and then we'll talk about the frontal lobes. We talked about the 4 lobes last week, and I would like to review them with you. So right here we have the frontal lobe, here we have the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe right here, and the temporal lobe below. Now, this is the cerebrum, which is really another word for brain. It's the big brain, so to speak. And right below the cerebrum, we find the cerebellum, the lesser brain, the smaller brain. Although this term, besides sheer size, it's not really justified. The cerebellum plays an important role in a variety of functions, including gait, for instance. Now, as you can see here, there are 2 tones of blue that indicate the central sulcus. Now, the central sulcus is extremely important because just like the Sylvian feature right here below, helps identify the distinction between frontal lobe and parietal lobe. It's also very important because it is related to both motor functions as well as sensory function. And this is something that we will see multiple times throughout the course. It appears to be that the frontal part of the system, specifically of the brain, is responsible for something that in Latin we would call aggredior, aggressor. Not aggression or aggressivity in a moral behavioral sense, but aggredior, aggression as in reaching out, grasping, conceptualizing. We mentioned that last week. And what is more important than conceptualizing that the motor function that allows this reaching out to occur? Now, this is very interesting because it brings together philosophical, theoretical, as well as strictly neurological functions. So how do we conceptualize? How do we grasp a concept? Well, by virtue of understanding, reaching out, and making this concept our own, putting in the box, the cognitive box that we previously created by virtue of recognizing objects. So if you see the portion right in front of the central sulcus, what is in front is, by definition, the motor cortex. Okay? What is in the back of the central sulcus is the somatosensory cortex of our brain. Now, this is also important for two main reasons. One, because it represents the central part of proprioceptive mechanism, and proprioception is a term that we utilize in theoretical science as well as in medicine to identify the ability of the body to recognize itself specifically in the context of visual spatial apprehension, motor control, and interaction with items and objects and the surrounding environment. So it's a proprioceptive mechanism that is predicated upon what we usually refer to as the homunculus, which is this interesting visual representation of how the brain is supposed to see itself inside our bodies. So again, this brings back the conversation we have had on embodied cognition. Now, as you would imagine, the homunculus will be reflected in terms of specific sizes based on how many receptor sites we have and how important that specific part is going to be. So for instance, we will have magnified lips, we'll have magnified sensory elements such as nose and ears, as well as genitalia, as well as our fingers, because those are the elements, the somatosensory motor elements that we utilize to navigate the world, to understand the world. Think about how children learn. They learn vicariously by observation, but also by putting things in their mouth, by understanding the environment, by touching things, by grabbing things. And so that's exactly how the brain understands itself. So let's continue. Let's take a look at the superior view of the brain here. Again, I'm going to put it right next to the light so hopefully you can see it. I'm going to zoom in. So we're starting here from the top, from the frontal lobe. As you can see here, you have all the convolutions of the brain, the sulci of brain. Right here on the side, you have the central gyrus. Then you have the precentral gyrus on top, or rather in front, the postcentral gyrus, and then the longitudinal cerebral fissure, which is eventually ending up here on the occipital lobe. Let's take a look at our brain model here with the central sulcus, precentral and postcentral gyrus in yellow and blue. I want you to pay attention though to a specific area of the brain right here, the longitudinal fissure right here from the frontal all the way to the occipital lobe. And then back here to the precentral sulcus and postcentral sulcus, temporal lobe, and back here in the back of the brain, lunate sulcus and occipital lobe, of course. So if someone's asking you what is the purpose, what's the main function of the frontal lobe, well, we have to think about executive function. We have to think about reaching out. We have to think about memory. We have to think about personality, reward system, rational, intellectual, cognitive process, higher cognitive functioning processes. We had to think about the ability to make sense of the world and putting all the things together, which is consistent to what we just said in terms of reaching out and grasping. How about the parietal lobe? What we just mentioned, the somatosensory function, and in fact this is one of the central function of the parietal lobe, including of course proprioceptive mechanisms. So if we had to sum up with three words the practical application of the function of the parietal lobe, we could think of light touch in general, pain, as well as temperature, which is kind of interesting because when we think about proprioception, we think about how we interact in the world from a somatosensory and pain receptor perspective, both pain in general, so nociceptive factor, as well as cognitive interpretation of pain. Now, of course, we just mentioned that in the context of cognition per se, the frontal lobe has this action portion. But since this course on critical neuroscience will be focused also on a practical clinical medical application of proprioceptive mechanism, now pain will be a fundamental concept to grasp. And this is also related to integrative methodologies to pain management, for instance. Now, one of the things that the brain does is interpreting the likelihood that the pain is indeed dangerous to us. The pain perception, by definition, is not pain itself. So in other words, pain, we could claim, exists only in the brain. It exists only as a result of interpretation. This is, of course, not to say that there are no empathetic need for understanding toward patients that are in physical and emotional pain. But by saying that the pain perception is only localized in the brain, we do not mean to say that pain perception on the individual level, it's not justified. In fact, nobody should claim to know how another person feels in terms of their emotional and physical pain by the person herself, because of course they are, after all, the ones who perceive pain. What we're trying to mean here is that since it's also about interpretation, because damage, tissue damage, for instance, or internal damage, and you know, internal or external trauma, do not necessarily match pain level. Okay, pain is information, and therefore any type of integrating mechanism, for instance, full body scans or meditation, the breathing exercise, etc., will have a direct impact on the way we perceive our pain in the very moment. We should also mention that there are chronological sequential factors in pain perception, and it's exactly what the parietal lobe is doing, by the way. What the message is all about is making sure that we pay attention to the aching area so that we don't cause further damage. Because if we didn't have pain perception, then we will most likely cause further disruption, for instance, in the context of internal hemorrhage. So pain is information. However, chronic pain, as we will see, ceases in many cases to have a proper balance between this piece of information on one side and the level of response that is needed. So to some extent, chronic pain is similar to a chronic stress response. It's a progressive accumulation of data that no longer qualifies as necessary for survival on one side, but also can be detrimental toward well-being in general. A good example that I can think of is, again, because of this interaction in the parietal lobe between pain, touch, and temperature, is how our response changes when we, for instance, are trying to wash our hands after we've been out in a very cold day. So you might turn on the water and you sink, and it might take you a few seconds, up to a few seconds, to really understand, physically speaking, understanding whether the water is very, very hot or very, very cold. And what is this? Well, the brain primary interest at that point from a neurobiological and evolutionary perspective is to making sure that the danger is limited. So if you think about the hierarchy of information, what is the most important thing? Well, making sure that what I am feeling in terms of sensation, okay, when perceiving, it's not dangerous. Only after the danger is monitored, I can, or rather the brain, can interpret that as very hot or very, very cold. Another good example is how the brain is purposely confusing inputs. It's purposely confusing nociceptive mechanism. And by nociception, of course, we identify this perceptual element of pain perception. It's confusing, again, these two stimuli, these two inputs. For instance, when we're thinking about this instinctual reaction we have when we hurt. So, for instance, I might bump against an item if I'm very clumsy, and I'm very well known to be that. And my instinctual, you could say, reaction, I'm using instinct as a metaphor now, of course, my instinctual reaction is to apply pressure to the aching element. For instance, I hurt my elbow against an item, against an inanimate object, and my first reaction is to add pressure. Ouch, I hurt. Now, of course, because the same process is interpreted by the same part of the brain, again, the parietal lobe here, pain and pressure will be confused. It is not true that the brain necessarily confuses in a metaphoric sense these two stimuli. The brain will know what is pressure and what is pain, of course, but it's able to confusing them from an etymological perspective, to fusing them together so that my pressure is soothing because overrides the pain mechanism, or rather the pain interpretation. The same thing in a more, I wouldn't say metaphoric, but in a more figurative sense, albeit identical from a neurological perspective, when I have a combination of emotional distress that might be translated eventually in emotional pain. Thinking about, again, the frontal lobes here that we just mentioned, we utilize for understanding the world on a cognitive level. let's assume that you're studying for a quiz and you cannot recall the answer. And you might have different sensation, different feelings. You might feel at first that you're trying so hard to almost squeeze the information out of you. You do something like this, I can't remember. So again, you're applying pressure and stimulation on the area that you are using to recall that piece of information. And after that, you might have a further interpretation of the current situation. For instance, you might feel either confusion because you didn't remember. You might feel even some level of guilt or shame because you should know the answer. It just doesn't come to you at the moment. So in any case, there is this combination of emotional, cognitive, and pain behavior, we could say, that are all merged together. Now, this is at first a confusing thing to think about, but in the end, if you think about what we said about embodied cognition, it makes total sense. The brain, or the body in this case, and the mind have two different languages, but the message, the core message, is indeed the same, whether we're talking about emotional pain or physical pain. So moving on, we just mentioned, again, this somatosensory and motor cortex. Since we were talking about the parietal lobe, let's move on to the occipital lobe right in the back. Part of this existence, three-dimensional existence, is visual spatial perception. And this is exactly the role of the occipital lobe, is understanding how to interpret objects, how to visualize them, how to rotate them in space, also to be able to recognize them. And of course, as a general summary, if someone were to ask you, so what is the occipital lobe? What is the main function? Well, it's the visual cortex, right? Because it has to do with vision. Now, quick interesting fact, when you think about occipital as a term, occipital of course has a semantic connection, etymological connection with occidental, okay, as opposed to oriental. So what is occidental and oriental? Well, oriental is this wonderful term that we utilize to define the east, where the sun rises, right? The horizon, okay? The orientation, oriens, okay, in Latin, where the sun rises. What about where the sun sets? Well, it's the opposite, it's the occident, okay? So is the west, okay? Occidental as western, oriental as eastern. So those are beautiful terms. And where occidental plays a role in the context of occipital, right, is this is this element of disappearing, of dying, of letting be, of making room for something new, for the inner night, we could say. And this is indeed connected to a pre-Indo-European Sanskrit term, CID, which has to do with this destruction, demolition, inner death. So it's not death in a moral and emotional sense, but it's the end, right? So it kind of makes sense also, visual, spatially, and figuratively thinking that the occipital lobe is at the end, right? It's the occidents of the brain, of the cerebrum, because the orients, of course, the east where everything starts, is the frontal lobe. Now, interestingly, to some extent paradoxically, the frontal lobe, as we mentioned, but particularly the prefrontal cortex, is the last one to be developed. So it's the new beginning, just as the sun rises in the Oriental interpretation. Now, of course, like many other things in historical linguistics, some might claim that this interpretation is altogether part of folk etymology, that there is indeed a complete distinction between, you know, occidental and occipital, or occidental and occipital, and among the claims that I heard over the years was that there is a forced element of medieval, which really doesn't have anything to do in terms of, you know, true development of history with pre-Indo-European migrations. It has to do with El Cid, which is of course the very famous literature piece in Spain, specifically the Islamic culture in Andalusia. But there are other interpretations, such as the very basic Latin etymology of the term occipital, which has to do with head. So ob plus caput. Caput, of course, is a term that you can find as a stem in anything related to the head. So caput mundi, right? It was the term associated with the city of Rome, the capital of the world, the head of the world. And this is another explanation that might be much more simple in terms, just because it presents exactly what the location of the occipital lobe is. So at the end of the head, right, and the posterior portion of the head. Just something to consider. Now let's move on to the very last lobe, so the fourth lobe. And again, there is no specific order that I will be using in this semester. Let's talk about the temporal lobe. Now, one of the things that I would like to stress about the temporal lobe is this, again, etymological connection between temple and temple. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, one of the most fascinating things about the brain, temple as in the sacred templum in Latin, and the other one, temple as in tempus. So what do these two words mean? Well, in the context of tempus, of course, in Latin, as well as many other Italic languages, including Romance languages, Italian for instance, this term, tempo, means both rhythm, weather, as well as time in general. And this is connected to an Indo-European root, ten, that is both to cut as well as to stretch. And this kind of makes sense in a chronological sense. Now, we don't have time to dig too deep in the etymology of different times of time, right? Different types of passing time. And if you're interested in this sense, just think about the Greek terms chronos, for instance, chronological, or aion, A-I-O-N, aion, right? That we can find in the eons in Latin. And think about the time as the time of human beings on this world, as opposed to the divine time, the time of the gods, which are very, very distinct. So what do we mean? Well, in terms of physiological structure, well, it's kind of makes sense. It's stretching, a stretched area, right? But it's also a sacred area. And this is the second etymology, templum. So the temple in a religious, spiritual, mythological sense is the presence of the gods. Now, this can be intimidating, and especially in a course such as critical neuroscience that focuses on this mind-body connection, this can be even scary when we think about those existential questions. Where do we come from? What makes us human? And interestingly enough, in many other languages that we partially mentioned, such as Italian, think about the term for an intense storm, temporale, right? It's the same etymology, which has Indo-European connection with other languages. Think about Gewitter, for instance, in German, and it is really reflected in the temporal. Here I have to be careful with this brain here because otherwise it'll fall apart. It has a connection with the temporal lobe and its specific function. So again, let's try to remember what we just said. So on one side you have the passing of time from tempus, right? This stretch, T-E-N, 10, from the Indo-European root. And on the other side you have this sacred element, this divine element connected to the temple. So when we think about the passing of time, we think about where we are in time. So we can think of memory, and this is indeed connected to the temporal lobe. Now we will see that we will have more of an opportunity to discuss memory when we talk about the hippocampus, but nevertheless, this is one of the functions. So hold on to your memory for a second. And on the other side, we have this divine presence, this mythological element, this godlike feature. And what has this to do with our temporal lobe? Well, it has to do with our sense of self on an emotional level and of a level of understanding. So not surprising, the temporal lobe is also related to hearing and speaking, so language. Now, as we previously mentioned, the general rule of thumb, which applies for the time being, according to which the frontal part of the brain is more aggredior based, more activation based, right? Executive function, reaching out based, and the posterior part is more sensitive, somatosensory, applies to this area of the brain as well. So think about, for instance, the differences between Wernicke and Broca's area. So of course, if we think of especially about the left hemisphere, we think of Wernicke area right here and Broca right in front of it. Now, we will talk more about the two neuroscientists that discovered these two areas. And Wernicke should really be pronounced Wernicke, and Broca should be really pronounced Broca. But in any case, the general idea is this. First of all, it's easy to remember because you just follow the alphabetical order, at least Latin-based alphabetical order. So the letter B comes before the letter W, right? So it's easy to remember. But what is in front has to do with motion. So since both Broca and Wernicke are related to language, you would imagine that the language in front will be something active and the language in the back will be something more passive, receptive, sensitive, sensory, and you'll be absolutely right in thinking that, because when the Broca area main function is speech production, so activation of those muscles that will allow us to make sensitive sounds, understandable sounds as we speak. The Wernicke area in the back will be the opposite, will be language understanding, comprehension. So this is a really fascinating way to look at the brain from a very basic perspective for now, but it's definitely connected to everything we said in terms of the connection between philosophy, mythology, theoretical science, and strict hard science as in neuroscience and neurology. So again, in this sense, we understand this storm, this inner storm, this temporalis, right? Because the temporal lobe is also involved with memory, with learning, and with emotions. So what's a better definition, description of who we are? We have all our senses, we have all our abilities to interact in the world, both from a somatosensory perspective as well as from a motor cortex perspective, and yet we interpret the world on an emotional level as well. That's how we learn, that's how we make sense. And again, this is connected to meaning and purpose in life. Now, I will mention multiple studies in this regard throughout this course, but if you want to think about one name, a neuroscientist that dedicated a lot of his work on this emotional backbone, I dare to say, toward many other higher functioning processes in the brain, think about Antonio Damasio, just to give you a name for now. But again, as you can see here, we have a combination of multiple aspects that each utilize a different language to express this innermost core of ourself. Wonderful. So since we talked about the exterior portion of the brain, at least the main elements of the four lobes, it's probably time to dig a little deeper, physically speaking, and take a look at what the brain reveals inside, what kind of treasures we have inside. And we'll do this by analyzing the sagittal section through the brain. Now, you might have heard me before saying sagittal or sagittal. Aside from my thick accent, I just want to mention that the term it's again connected to cutting through. Sagitta is Latin for arrow, piercing arrow. And so, if you want to use the archaic pronunciation of Latin, that would be sagittalis, so sagittal section through the brain. Now, again, I will try to be closer to the light to make sure that you can all see it, and I will zoom in. So the first thing you notice here is this big pink structure, the pons that you can see here in the medulla oblongata. Now, of course, pons is just Latin for bridge, because it's kind of wrapped around, looks like this potato-like structure wraps around the medulla oblongata right here. And then, of course, you have one of the main elements here, which is the thalamus here, with the interthalamic adhesion. You have the cerebral pedicle here, the mammillary bodies, and the pituitary stalk right here, the fornix. And then you have this little green element here. Let's see if I can take it out right here, which is the fourth ventricle, cerebellum, and the arbor vitae, the tree of life right here, as if you can see it here, right? And this is very interesting because aside from the very structure here that really resemble leaves, like tree leaves, and of course the Latin term, the equivalent Latin term is just folia, which is either Italian or Latin for leaves. And then right above you have the vermis. Let's see if we can put it back here. The vermis of the cerebellum, okay, and right above you have on the opposite side you have the tectum, which is the roof of the midbrain. Now, to continue up here, we just mentioned the occipital lobe right here in the back of the brain, the calcarine sulcus right below, right above, and then of course you go toward the superior part of the cerebrum here with the cortex. Now, this inner portion here that really covers the interiormost part of the limbic system here is the cingulate gyrus, and then you have, of course, the rostrum of the corpus callosum, which is very, very important because it represents the connection between right and left hemisphere. Let me just take a quick break here to look straight at the camera again. It's important because it is connected to connection itself. So the corpus callosum as the connection between right and left hemisphere. We will talk about this multiple times throughout the course because the corpus callosum in itself is a fundamental portion of this course, I dare to say, because it provides more neuroscientific basis for investigation on, are we just one thing or are we multiple parts? More specifically, can we be separate within ourselves? And I'm not mentioning anything philosophical yet, or even psychological yet. I'm just mentioning the possibility of having the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere divided. I just confused these two. The right hemisphere and the left hemisphere divided. And one of the most fascinating research studies, longitudinal studies conducted for over 15 years, is the research on corpus callosotomy, and you probably all heard of the name of Dr. Gazzaniga. So for that specific research, I will encourage students to take a look at the bibliographical references at the end of this chapter, as well as the linked videos on the research by Dr. Gazzaniga on corpus callosotomy and this right versus left brain separation and distinction. But to continue here, let me go back to the light. Right below here we have, again, the pituitary gland, we have the temporal lobe, the optic nerve, the hypothalamus, the anterior rostral commissure, the frontal lobe, and then you can see that the very last portion here is the epithalamus. So again, let me come a little closer to the camera to see if I can show you all these parts up close here. All right, so now we could say many more things about the limbic system in general. One of the areas that I feel it's really important to memorize is, or rather are, because we have a set of two, the amygdala. Okay, these almond-shaped glands, and the term amygdala, of course, is Greek for almond, that are connected with our emotional backbone, I would say, with our fight and flight response. All right, and since the amygdala and the limbic system in general is so important, I feel I should probably pull up a picture, a little image on the whiteboard, just to show you the main structure and function, and then we'll continue our conversation. So let me make sure that I erase the previous descriptors here. All right, and bear with me 1 second. I will pull up that picture. All right, so here we go. All right, so, sorry, there's still a few things left here, orbital frontal. All righty, okay. So as you can see here, you know what, I might just take this down so it's easier for all of us to see. Great. All right, so, wonderful. So, again, the sagittal section through the brain, and the main areas that are highlighted here are connected, of course, to the limbic system. Now, on your, let me see, on your left side, I hope so, you find this amygdala, again, this almond-shaped gland right here, that is responsible for the fight and flight processes, specifically emotional understanding, emotional control, responses to fear, anxiety, as well as interpretation of everything that is really non-verbal, okay? Which, of course, is also connected to the way we interact in the world, the emotional response, but also emotional responsiveness and our motivation to do something, because this is connected to what we said earlier about this aggregator concept, the one that pushes us forward, motivates us, and so on and so forth. Now, right here on top, we see again the cingulate cortex, okay, which of course comes from the Latin cingulus. It's pretty self-explanatory, and cortex again is Latin for bark, not bark, you know, as a dog, but bark as in the external portion, the layer as in the tree, which is the primary cortical component of the limbic system. And again, this is the intersection which is involved both in emotional and emotional processing as well as in cognition. The thalamus, one of the central kings, I would say, of the brain, all right? It's part of the forebrain, as we mentioned multiple times, that relays information from sensory organs to the cortex, to the cerebral cortex. And the hypothalamus, okay? So the Greek terminology still holds true. Hypothalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus, okay? Opposite of hyper, so the smaller portion, the one below, right? Is a part of the forebrain, again, that regulates the amount of fear, thirst, sexual drives, and aggression we feel, and we interpret, I would say. We have these two binary elements, these two parallel paths. On one side you have emotions, and on the other side you have feelings. Now, from, sorry, light a little too strong here. From a etymological standpoint, you could say that emotions and feelings are indeed the same thing. Feeling is, of course, a Germanic word, and of course, English is a Germanic language, albeit mixed with Romance, Italic languages, specifically French. So feelings will be the Germanic part or counterpart to emotion, which is the true Romance, Italic, Latin counterpart. Okay? Emotions, not surprisingly, come from ex movio, moving away from something. So as you can see here, the description here, amygdala influences our motivation, right? Emotional control, and then hypothalamus, regulation of sexual drive, amount of fear, and aggression. So you have these two components coming together, this moving forward, this aggression as well as emotional control. What we're gonna do with our emotions, okay? Ex movio, moving away from, for instance, threats, as opposed to fight. So again, fight and flight response. Finally, this light blue structure here that really looks like a seahorse, and not surprisingly, the Greek term for seahorse is hippocampus, as you would imagine, right, from hippo, right? The hippocampus plays a role in our learning, memory, and ability to compare sensory information to expectations. So it's also the part that that is able to incarnate us, to root us, to glue what we will imagine is going to happen and what is happening at the moment. So when we think about expectation, we also think about memory. We project something into the future and we have expectation whether this future will match our expectations or not. This will be part of the psychological analysis that we will embark on chapter file. But for now, this is just a general overview of the sagittal section of the limbic system. All right, so I feel that we did a good job so far talking about the four lobes and the limbic system. But of course, since the brain is part of the central nervous system, the CNS, I feel we should at least talk about the basic elements of our spinal cord. And so bear with me, I will just grab a model for a vertebra. I hope I have, yes, I have a fifth cervical vertebra, and you can see here with portion of the spinal cord, the origin of nerves. Let me see if I can actually hold it up to the camera so you can see up close. Let me see, right on, perfect. Okay, great, so as you can see here, you see the whole body of the vertebra, which in Latin as, hold it here, which in Latin is pretty much the translation, the corpus vertebra, corpus vertebrae, the transverse process, the vertebral arch, the spinous process, etc., etc. And maybe the one of the core elements that I would like students to remember is the dura mater or dura mater of the spinal cord. So that the strong mother. Now, of course, etymologically speaking, those are both related, matter and mother, right? So the dura mater spinalis. Now you can see numbers here right below. Let's see if I can identify here. Maybe I can just add it later on the video. You have the arachnoid of the spinal cord, which, you know, in Latin it's feminine, so it's arachnoidea spinalis. The subarachnoid cavity, the cavum subarachnoidale, which is, of course, it's filled with spinal fluid. The internal vertebral venous plexus, which is, again, plexus venosi, anterior and posterior. The denticulate ligament, again, anterior and posterior. The subarachnoid septum of the spinal cord. The ventral root of the cervical nerve, the dorsal root, so front and back, right, of the cervical nerve, the spinal ganglion spinale in Latin, the anterior ramus of nerve, and the posterior ramus of nerves. Ramus, it's Latin as well, so ramus nervi cervicalis posterior and anterior, right? The sympathetic trunk, the ramus communicans between, of course, the sympathetic trunk and the spinal nerve, the pia mater, the spinal cord, pia mater spinalis, and a few more things here, the anterior median fissure, the anterior lateral sulcus, the posterior lateral sulcus, the posterior median fissure, posterior glial septum, the anterior funicle, the lateral funicle, the posterior funicle, the white substance, gray substance, central canal, anterior column, lateral column, and posterior column. Wonderful. So after this brief examination of the spinal cord, we will move on to the blood supply of the brain. And for this course, I don't really expect students to remember all the details about the blood supply to the brain. For now, it will be enough to remember the common acronym I.V.A.R or I.V.A.R, so I.V.A.R, to identify the four main arteries supplying the brain. So where I stands for internal carotid arteries, V stands for vertebral arteries, A stands for arterial circular villus, and finally R stands for regional blood supply to the cerebrum. So that's really all I need you to remember for now. Moving on, we will talk more about the specific function and structures, but I feel the need of examining a theoretical part or portion of this chapter, examining, controlling, verifying. Let me actually change the picture. If we can discuss that briefly, or actually, let me just begin by mentioning a few concepts before we share more images. Now, when we talk about the brain, we talk about one of the portion of this mind-body connection, and this is something that I feel we dedicated enough time, at least from a philosophical perspective, to understand the basics. Now, I would like to go back to etymology, and you'll see, if you're attending this course or if you attended other courses in the past, that I pay specific attention to etymological roots of the terms we utilize, not just because they're very useful in understanding scientific and biomedical perspective, but also because they contain truth. They contain universal truth, in fact, truth that can be found cross-culturally and also not just across space, but also across time. Now, there's always a risk of over-interpreting things, of reading too much between the lines, like with everything that has to do with philosophy, psychology, and to say anything that it's not evidence-based laboratory science, although even in that case, that there is some level of epidemiology and interpretation that plays a role. But the point I'm trying to make is that if we analyze words, then a whole new world will be opening to us. So think about the opposite part. So we talked about the brain, let's talk about the mind. Now, is there anything that we could say about the role that the mind plays in the context of making us alive, making us feeling alive? We're feeling, we're connecting, we're emotionally responding, but also gives us life itself. Now, in metaphorical, mythological, transcendental, religious, spiritual terms, life is very often connected to breath. Okay? So, in the context of the brain, we generally talk about, first of all, the nervous system as well as the endocrine system. For the most part, we talk about neurons and hormones. So neurons, of course, for the nervous system, and hormones for the endocrine system. These two sides of the same coin. And we talk about electromagnetic function, chemical function, so on and so forth. But when we talk about what makes us alive, the talk opens up even more. Because you could argue that even though neurological functions do represent neural underpinnings for pretty much anything we experience in this world, our experience in this world is constructed and predicated upon our perception itself. In other words, we create our world the very moment in which we interact with the world. So to some extent, we are part of nature, and we're also against nature because we are monitoring what's external to us. Think about what we said last week regarding this double hermeneutics, right? So what makes us alive? Well, if we think about psychological processes, I would like to go back to the very root of psychology, which is psyche. Now, psyche, it's a term that you can find in Greek that identifies the soul, okay, in the broadest possible term, but also very specific, as well as the butterfly, right? One of the core elements of antiquity, and this is true for the Romans, for the Greeks, and many other antique culture, is the notion that our soul is by definition immortal. It does not die, it does not suffer biological death. So there is this element of ether, of non-embodied manifestation, as in something that gives breath of life. Now this concept of breath or wind or respiration, it's found throughout the ancient world, interestingly enough. You can find that in Greek, again, you can think about terms such as pneuma, right? Pneuma, think about pneumonia, for instance. We tend to mispronounce that, pneuma. You can think of Latin spiritus, right? Spirit, spiritual, kind of self-explanatory. You can find it in Germanic languages, Geist in German, which is ghost, although in modern English, ghost took on this very negative, occult, almost dark perspective, but really it was just a translation for spirit. In fact, if you take a look at traditional Catholic and Orthodox texts, you hear terms such as the Holy Ghost as opposed to the Holy Spirit. Those terms are pretty much identical from the perspective that we're taking here. Now, you might also argue, well, this is true for most, Indo-European and antiquity, so pagan times, but would it be true for other cultures? Would it be true for an intersection between Indo-European culture and Semitic culture, or Hamitic culture even? Because one of the things that very often is discussed is the apparent difference between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in this very order, in connection to things such as biological death, separation between mind and body, and resurrection, reformation, restructuring, as opposed to pagan, if you want to use this term, which is somewhat, misrepresenting the culture, but in terms of, for lack of a better term, polytheistic Indo-European culture where the soul was always separate from the body. And so one might argue, so what happens after that is this this inner life breath, this soffio vitale, we would say in Italian, this external and internal breath. Does it continue after life or not? Are we, our bodies and our soul together, or do those two things separate? Well, in Semitic languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, you find ruach as a term, or rach, depending which etymology you follow, which has exactly the same meaning. So this spirit, this ghost, this breath. And you can find that in other Indo-European roots. For instance, you think about Atma, right? You can find in Sanskrit, as well as in German, you find Atmen for breathing, right? For the respiratory process. And this is fascinating because the general idea is that we are animated bodies. And so if you look back at what we just said about the brain, what is the animating factor? It's this divine breath. It's this innermost function that makes life possible. Now, of course, for clarity and also for lack of time, we could make many other examples. Again, example about the connection historically, etymologically, and theoretically between breath, spirit, and life. Again, another example in this context would be found in Slavic languages. Think about duch, dusha, with multiple interpretation, but connected to the same core. So spirit and soul, right, as well as ghost, and even what appear to be false friends in linguistics, but etymologically connected. Think about spirare and sperare in Italic languages, even in modern Italian, where the first element, spirare spelled with the I, indicates to die, and the second one will indicate to hope, okay? So expiration date, for instance. Well, I want to thank you all for being here during week 3. I will see you all on week 4 next week. And we will continue the fascinating discussion on critical neuroscience. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.